WSB & Co.'s The Rabbit's Tales. Chapter 1, Glimmer. Tale 2, Scrap at the Scrapyard. WSB was exhausted. He hadn't been able to have a comfortable place to rest since he had been created a few days ago. His first try was to rent a room at a hotel, but that evidently costs money that he didn't know how to get a hold of. His second try was to find a nice comfy spot in the forest, but as he quickly learned, it's not fun to be without a roof when it starts raining. His most recent attempt was to visit a homeless shelter, but the general reception to a walking cartoon with razor-sharp teeth and glowing eyes wasn't exactly a positive one. He just wanted to find a bed to sleep in. Was that so much to ask? After leaving the homeless shelter, he strolled down the street, exhausted. WSB looked down at the relic in his hand and yawned.
Hey, fancy magic voices. Do you have any advice on how I can hit the hay somewhere?
He asked the relic. Unfortunately, he received no response, and hadn't heard anything from those voices since they told him he was the Keeper of Light. His eyes fluttered, and he nearly fell asleep, almost dropping the relic. He panicked and woke himself back up, gripping the relic tightly. He hadn't let go of the legendary relic of Alpha Tigris since he had first taken it, but if he didn't get some shut-eye soon, he was going to pass out and likely drop it somewhere. That was something he had to avoid. WSB decided to check himself for any potential pockets or nooks he could put the relic, when he noticed his big fluffy tail. That'd be the perfect place for it. He wedged it in there, and it sat tightly in the cottony fluff. Nice! He continued walking down the city street, keeping an eye out for anything he could rest his head on, when he came across a large roofed junkyard. Well, it wasn't the best choice, but it would keep the weather out, and no one would freak out since no one was in there. He stepped inside and glanced around, scanning his surroundings. There were piles of scrap metal and occasional trash objects scattered all over. There were also a few small animals digging and crawling around the junk. It wasn't exactly the most pleasant of surroundings, but it could be worse. As he wandered around the mountains of junk metal, he spotted a medium-sized, mostly intact spring mattress propped up against a pile of some junk.
Bingo! I've always wanted to sleep on one of those cozy mattresses,
he exclaimed happily. WSB ran towards it, but suddenly tripped over a paint can and fell on his face. When he did, the relic came dislodged from his tail and bounced against the dirt, landing on the ground in front of him. He jolted up to grab it, but was puzzled to see a second one lying next to it. Looking closely, he realized it was actually just an old rusty spoon someone had thrown out. Feeling relieved and a little embarrassed for having mixed the two up, he picked up his relic inside, placing it safely in his tail. He looked back down at the rusted spoon. He decided he might as well take that with him too. It could potentially be a useful thing to have on hand in case he needed to make a diversion of some sort. He yawned and looked out at the night sky, seeing the stars shimmering against the big black ink. Excited to finally have a place to sleep, he popped himself down on the mattress and quickly fell unconscious. Noir Rabbit was exhausted. He'd tried several times within the past few days to retrieve the legendary relic of Alpha Tigris from WSB, but all attempts had been unsuccessful. WSB was the minion Noir Rabbit had created to retrieve the very relic said minion now wielded. Noir Rabbit had intended to create a servant which could bring him the object of importance, but ended up incidentally creating the new Keeper of Light. It was now Noir Rabbit's mission to slay WSB and retrieve the relic so he could continue with his initial plan. But it had been more difficult than expected. Noir Rabbit had tried on several different occasions to surprise and attack WSB, but the rabbit's reflexes were too quick. One of the most relic's powerful attacks is activated when it is thrown, as when it strikes something, it releases a powerful burst of light magic, which is extremely effective on a being of pure dark magic such as Noir Rabbit. Thus, it was becoming evidently clear that Noir Rabbit could not just face WSB directly. However, since he was the Gaia of Darkness, he had the ability to detect when WSB was asleep. Noir Rabbit just had to wait until WSB was unconscious, and he could warp to him and steal the relic. After waiting for a couple days, Noir Rabbit finally detected that WSB was asleep, and quickly teleported to his direct location. When he arrived, he glanced around to figure out where he was. It was some sort of roofed junkyard. Noir Rabbit scanned the area and spotted WSB nearby, fast asleep on an old spring mattress. Excellent, he whispered, and instinctively went to take the relic from WSB while he slept. Suddenly, though, he stopped and thought for a moment. If WSB was to wake up while he was trying to take the relic from him, that rabbit would just retaliate with another attack! No, Noir Rabbit couldn't just take it himself. He should instead do what he does best, and create a minion to do it for him. That being said, the last minion he gave life to was WSB, who betrayed him. If Noir Rabbit wanted to make a minion, he'd have to think about what went wrong with WSB in order to make sure he didn't make that same mistake.
Well, let's see. WSB ended up betraying me because he decided for himself that he didn't want to serve me. It was a clever move, using the relic to best me, and perhaps that's the issue. If I'm to make a minion that will stay true to my vision, I need one that isn't nearly as clever and instead loyal. Brilliant, Noir Rabbit, you're a genius. You deserve an award for your wits.
He whispered to himself. Well, whispered in quotation marks. He then materialized a golden trophy and podium in front of himself.
I'd like to thank the Academy for granting me the Smartest Gaia of Darkness award. I couldn't have done it without the love and support of my adoring fans.
He whispered to himself. He then tossed the trophy and podium away and turned back to WSB.
Alright, WSB, it's time to show you why you don't mess with the Gaia of Darkness.
He muttered to himself sinisterly.
Now, let's see what we've got to work with.
He mumbled to himself. He scanned around the scrapyard, looking at the different piles of junk. Perfect. Noir Rabbit raised his arms as the air began to swirl all around him. Pieces of trash and scrap metal began forming together. Wires, bolts, chunks of rusted iron, and several other different pieces of junk merged together, taking a shape very similar to WSB. Jagged, jointed metal teeth filled a tin mouth, as two rabbit ears formed out of cable and planks. One hand was made out of the claw of an old arcade claw machine, an arm out of half a bicycle. The minion was about halfway done when WSB suddenly spoke up behind him.
Noir Rabbit, there you are!
WSB exclaimed. Noir Rabbit panicked, dropping his half-formed creation on the ground in front of him, and looking back to face WSB.
I was waiting on that pizza. There better not be any anchovies on there this time.
Mumbled WSB. Noir Rabbit then realized that he just happened to be talking in his sleep. Noir Rabbit muttered before looking back to continue constructing his newest minion. As he was about to continue working on it, though, his creation began to move. Crawling on its two arms, it turned to face Noir Rabbit and looked up at him with its single eye. Noir Rabbit had accidentally brought his minion to life prematurely. Surprisingly, its lack of legs made it significantly more unsettling, with cables dragging behind it as it crawled around. That, alongside the oil leaking from its eye and jointed teeth, were enough to convince Noir Rabbit that this creation was complete.
Yes! Alright, my new minion! I shall call you!
Whispered Noir Rabbit before pausing. He hadn't thought of a name for this being. Perhaps something to do with roguery or being beguiling? Then again, though, he'd used both of those names before for roguery hounds and beguiling mimics previously. Perhaps he could instead just name it after himself. Maybe the Noir Rabbit Automaton? No, that felt too on the nose. His creation was not actually an automaton, as automatons are mechanical and powered by electricity, and this was just sentient junk given life via dark magic. But the name sounded cool, so he didn't mind. Perhaps, instead of just using his current name, he could use one of the former names humans used to refer to him. And Noir Rabbit knew exactly which one to use.
You shall be known as the NightHare Automaton! And perhaps something like Otto could be a cute nickname or something, eh?
Noir Rabbit stated proudly. Otto barked in response, which puzzled Noir Rabbit for a moment, but he remembered wanting to make this loyal as possible, and dogs are known for loyalty, so this worked in his favor.
Now, my minion, you have a simple task to complete. You see that sleeping fool over there?
Noir Rabbit explained while pointing towards WSB resting on the mattress. Otto glanced over at him before looking back up at Noir Rabbit and nodding.
Well, your task is a simple one. That traitor is named WSB, and he wields a very special item known as the legendary relic of Alpha Tigris. This relic looks exactly like a spoon, but don't be fooled! It is far more dangerous than one. You must collect it and bring it back to me. I'll be waiting in the woods for you to return.
Noir Rabbit stated quietly, explaining his plan. His minion barked again and scurried off into the junkyard. Noir Rabbit laughed to himself with an evil sense of satisfaction. This time, he was going to finally get that relic. He teleported away into the woods to await his minion's return. WSB was abruptly awoken, as he thought he had heard Noir Rabbit's voice. Glancing around the junkyard, he didn't see anything but, well, junk, so he laid back down to rest. The air was still and quiet for a minute, but he suddenly heard the sound of something rustling about within the junkyard. He sat back up and scanned the area again. Nothing. Maybe it was just one of those critters he saw before? Probably just a rat eating some trash, so it was nothing to worry about. He laid his head back down, trying to fall back asleep. Once more, though, the rustling began, and this time it was closer. WSB sat back up and looked around. It had to just be like a rat, right? It's gotta be just a rat! He laid his head back down for a third time. But this time, he was keeping his eyes wide open. At this point, sleep was out of the question. He heard the rustling for a third time. Only this time, it was on the pile of junk right behind him! He stood up and turned around in terror to see what could possibly be making such a noise! Rather than some horrific beast, though, he saw a small rat standing atop the pile of scrap. WSB gave a sigh of relief. What was he so worried about anyways? Right as he relaxed, a set of metal jaws sprung up from the scrap and snapped shut around the rat like a shark, splattering its blood all over the pile of junk. WSB shrieked in horror as the set of jaws sunk back below the junk pile. WSB jumped up and ran to the other side of the junkyard, horrified. He glanced back to face the pile of junk he'd seen the jaws burst out from, only to hear metal shifting behind him instead. He turned back around to see the origin of the sound. Standing atop a pile of scrap was a large beast made out of junk and rusted metal. It stood on two legs with cables dragging out behind it. It sported jointed teeth, each being able to move independently, akin to tiny limbs. Its whole body was a cluster of different junkyard items, and atop its head were two rabbit ears, which led WSB to know in an instant that this was a creation of Noir Rabbit. The metal monster's single eye rolled out from the back of its head, facing forward to stare at WSB as its tiny glowing pupils stared into his soul. WSB screamed and cartoonishly turned pale white in color as he began to run for his life. As he did, Otto made chase. WSB ran towards the exit, but Otto cut him off, charging forward to block his path. WSB turned tail and bolted in the opposite direction as Otto chased behind. He managed to make enough distance to duck behind one of the junk piles to hide. The automaton seemed to be searching for him, scanning the area. The creature was utterly horrified in both appearance and actions. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe, it just hunted him. WSB was terrified, but took a moment to steady his breathing. He just had to think clearly. If this thing was really a minion of Noir Rabbit, it was likely just as weak to light magic as he was. Surely, all WSB had to do was to get a good hit on it, and it would be bested. Right? He didn't get the chance to think it through too much before the automaton bursted out from the pile of junk, sending scrap flying everywhere. It screeched at him, baring its teeth. Said teeth moved around in its mouth like wiggling worms as the automaton opened his mouth to attempt to bite down on WSB. WSB managed to leap out of the way, getting a good few feet of distance. Otto scurried after him, slashing and biting in a flurry of attacks. Before it reached him, WSB tossed the relic at the automaton. On impact, it released a massive burst of light, causing the monster to burst into pieces that went flying across the junkyard. The relic boomeranged back into WSB's hand, and the beast seemed to have been bested, as he breathed a sigh of relief. His relief was short-lived, though, as a moment later, he saw the pieces of the entity begin sliding across the ground. They moved as if being pulled in by a magnet, until they slowly reassembled right before his very eyes. WSB shrieked again, and tried to outrun it, but the automaton split parts of itself off. The loose parts crawled around on the ground before wrapping around his legs. WSB tumbled into the dirt, and tried shaking his legs to get the pieces of metal off his feet, but it was no use. The automaton crawled forward before standing atop of WSB, pinning him to the ground. The beast stared down at him and opened its jaws. WSB saw that they were still dripping with fresh blood as the entity moved its jaws closer to him. If he didn't do anything, his head would be crushed by its razor-sharp fangs. He didn't have enough experience to best this thing in combat, and he clearly couldn't outrun it, but maybe he didn't have to. An idea struck WSB, and he quickly spoke up before the automaton could crush his cranium.
Okay, I yield! Sheesh! I'll give you what you want already. Here, hang on.
He muttered while reaching down into his tail. The automaton closed its mouth and backed up a foot as WSB dug through his tail. After a second, WSB pulled out the rusted spoon he had grabbed earlier. He held it out to the NightHare Automaton, crossing his fingers that this would work.
Here you go. Is this what you wanted?
Asked WSB. The automaton looked at the spoon for a second, before happily nodding, quickly shifting its demeanor and taking it from him with its mouth. WSB stepped back as the automaton happily scurried off with the rusted spoon in hand. WSB waited until it was out of sight before sighing and chuckling to himself.
I wasn't too particularly attached to that one,
He said, pulling out the real relic of Alpha Tigris and investigating it.
You can keep that one.
He said with a chuckle before continuing.
I've got a better one anyways.
Norbit sat eagerly in the woods, waiting for Otto to return. He had been hearing WSB screaming quite a few times, so he knew that things had to have been going well. After a few minutes of silence, he heard the sound of rustling approaching him through the woods. Noirrabbit turned and saw his minion standing below him, with the relic in his mouth, staring up at him with puppy dog eyes, or in this case, eye.
Yes! 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 Excellent work, my valiantly loyal minion!
Noirrabbit boasted excitedly. He lowered down and held out his hand to Otto. Otto dropped the relic into Noirrabbit's hand and barked happily.
Now, with the legendary relic of light finally under my control, I can
began Noirrabbit before he suddenly paused. Upon closer inspection, this wasn't the legendary relic of Alpha Tigris at all. It was a regular old spoon. Noirrabbit let out an incredibly loud and slow sigh while face-palming. Otto looked up at him, tilting his head in confusion. Noirrabbit looked down at him, feeling incredibly frustrated for a moment. However, he decided to let it go.
I see what he did here. He took advantage of your simple mind and tricked you with a false relic. I see now why a minion with weak wits was the wrong choice,
he muttered. He then looked down at Otto and smiled.
That being said, you evidently were clearly doing well considering the ruckus I was hearing over there. And what's more is you could resist the attacks from the relic, which is also very useful to have.
Noirrabbit complimented. He then looked up at the shimmering stars above.
Perhaps the right way to defeat WSB is not by leaning into mirroring his strengths, but summoning one of his own kind,
Noirrabbit muttered. He then thought back to the building filled with comics and cartoons as a toothy smile spread across his face.
Come now, NightHare Automaton. We have a new minion to bring into our army of darkness, one that will truly rival our foe,
Noirrabbit muttered with a sinister chuckle. Otto tilted his head in confusion before the two of them warped away, disappearing in a burst of darkness.